In the early months of 1869, as spring loosened winter's grip over the industrial town of Dudley, a troubling event unfolded inside one of its modest homes. A boilermaker named Joseph Oliver, known among his neighbours as a steady, hard-working man, suddenly fell gravely ill. His final decline came on Whit Sunday, and by the time the holiday had passed, Joseph was dead. At first, his passing was accepted as one more unfortunate but ordinary death in the Black Country. His doctor attributed it to a vague ailment involving the liver, and the burial went ahead without controversy. Yet the peace surrounding his death would not last. Rumours began to drift through the close-knit streets of Hart's Hill, quiet remarks turning into pointed whispers, until a murmur of suspicion grew loud enough for the police to take notice. Within weeks, Joseph's body would be raised from the ground, examined in cold detail, and at the centre of the storm stood his own wife, a young milliner named Frances Maria Oliver. To those who knew them casually, Joseph and Frances appeared to share a respectable, settled life. Their 5-year marriage, at least outwardly, had none of the outward signs of trouble. Joseph, disciplined and industrious, had accumulated a respectable amount of savings, about £100, a sum significant enough to represent years of careful labour. He kept this money in a Wolverhampton building and investment society, believing it would provide a measure of security for his modest household. Frances, meanwhile, made her living crafting and trimming hats, a trade requiring skill, taste, and delicate hands. She had come from what was regarded as a respectable family in Birmingham, and to all appearances she fit comfortably into the role of a working wife in a striving industrial town. But beneath the well-kept surface of their life, another story was unfolding, one Joseph never realised was unfolding around him. Months before his death, Frances had secretly renewed a relationship from her past. The man was a butcher from Wolverhampton, someone she had once cared for deeply before marrying Joseph. His surname was Burgess, and with him she had begun a clandestine correspondence, sending affectionate letters that would later be read aloud in a courtroom. In these letters, the prosecution would claim she spoke bitterly of her marriage and hinted at her desire for freedom from the man she claimed to despise. While the letters were damning enough, an even more troubling truth emerged as police began asking questions. Over the previous year, Frances had steadily drained her husband's savings account, not in one rash moment, but in 8 separate withdrawals, each executed with careful planning. She had not dared sign Joseph's name herself. Instead, she persuaded a local youth to copy her husband's signature onto withdrawal slips. She warned him sternly never to mention the matter to Joseph, as though the very knowledge of her actions might shatter the fragile world she lived in. Nearly the entire £100 had vanished, and some portion of that money, it was later claimed, had made its way into the hands of the butcher she still secretly loved. Then came an act much darker than theft, an act that, once discovered, would shock Dudley to its core. On the 27th of April 1869, Frances walked into the shop of a local chemist, a man referred to simply as Mr. G. He was accustomed to selling the usual medicines, ointments, and household mixtures required by the townspeople. But on that day, Frances asked for arsenic. Under the law, the sale of such a dangerous substance required safeguards. It had to be mixed with soot or dye so that it could not be mistaken for anything safe, and its purchase needed to be entered into the chemist's register with proper signature and witness. Yet Frances insisted she needed it undiluted for bonnet cleaning, a claim technically plausible but suspicious enough that the chemist hesitated. She argued so confidently, appeared so composed and respectable that he relented. He sold her 2 ounces of pure, uncoloured arsenic, and she did not dare sign her own name. Instead, she wrote the name of her lover, Burgess, into the chemist's book. Her deceit did not end there. Rather than risk returning in person, she sent a girl known as Parker to the shop soon after, with another slip requesting a second quantity of arsenic, again using Burgess's name. The chemist, now thoroughly misled, sold the poison once more, this time without any witness present. These purchases, small and unobtrusive at the time, would later become the backbone of the prosecution's case. While her secret actions accumulated, Joseph's health began to deteriorate in ways that seemed mysterious to those around him. The doctor in attendance, a surgeon named Mr. Simmons, saw nothing overtly criminal in his symptoms. Arsenic poisoning, after all, was difficult to detect without specialised examination, and its symptoms often mimicked those of common gastrointestinal illnesses. Joseph suffered bouts of vomiting, crippling stomach pain, and profound weakness. Each episode only grew worse, yet crucially no suspicions were raised, nothing beyond a tragic and unexplained illness in a hard-working man whose vigour had suddenly collapsed. On the 16th of May, Joseph Oliver died. His doctor, still unaware of any foul play, issued a certificate stating the cause as hepatic congestion, a vague and non-specific diagnosis, the kind commonly given in the absence of clear evidence. Joseph was buried within days. For a time, it seemed the matter was settled forever. But the people of Harts Hill had not overlooked Frances's recent behaviour. They had seen her slips to Wolverhampton, witnessed the presence of the butcher Burgess, and overheard whispers of letters passed between them. They had noticed her strange movements around the time her husband first fell ill and spoken quietly about her trips to the chemist. Slowly these rumours made their way to the police. Concerned about the possibility of a hidden crime, the authorities began to investigate discreetly. As they gathered testimony, learning of the forged bank withdrawals and the poison bought under an alias, suspicion hardened into conviction. Joseph's death might not have been natural at all. To uncover the truth, they would need Joseph's body. Permission was obtained, and in a grim ceremony that horrified the community, his coffin was disturbed and raised. A post-mortem examination was carried out by 2 surgeons. Later, as doubts lingered and questions remained, a second exhumation was ordered specifically to examine his brain. The contents of his stomach were sealed and sent to a renowned analyst in Birmingham named Alfred Hill, who conducted a detailed chemical investigation. After what was described as a thorough and intricate analysis, Hill reached a stark and decisive conclusion. Arsenic was present in Joseph's stomach. In the judgment of all 3 medical experts involved, Joseph Oliver had died from deliberate poisoning. Armed with this scientific evidence, the police moved swiftly. On June 11th, Frances was arrested and brought before the magistrates at the Dudley Petty Sessions. Word of the accusations had already spread rapidly, and by the time she entered the courtroom, it was packed with onlookers eager to witness every moment of what had become the most sensational event in the region. Frances, dressed in black, appeared agitated and distressed. Her solicitor attempted to counter the evidence, but after hearing the testimony of Mr. Hill and others, the magistrates determined there was more than enough grounds to send her forward for trial at the Worcester Assizes. The trial began on the 19th of July, 1869, presided over by a High Court judge. From the outset, the prosecution established its narrative with cold precision. They outlined Frances's rekindled romance, the stolen savings, the forged signatures, and the arsenic purchases made under a false name. They spoke of Joseph's sudden illness and emphasized that he only vomited after meals prepared by his wife. The implication was clear. She had both motive and opportunity. Her barrister countered as best he could. He argued that Frances and Joseph had lived peaceably for years, that her past relationship with Burgess had ended once before, and might have again, and that no witness had seen her put poison into her husband's food. He reminded the court that arsenic was commonly used in the millinery trade, and that another person, the girl Parker, also assisted in the kitchen. But the thread of doubt he attempted to weave was thin. The jury retired for barely 20 minutes before returning with a decision, guilty, though with a recommendation for mercy. Frances broke into desperate weeping, proclaiming her innocence with frantic appeals to God. Yet her pleas changed nothing. The judge donned the black cap and pronounced the ritual sentence of death. The verdict should have ended the matter, but the days that followed proved that even after the sentence of death had been spoken, Frances Maria Oliver's story was far from over. While the courtroom still buzzed with the shock of her conviction, another figure found himself facing legal consequences. The Dudley chemist who had twice sold Frances pure, uncoloured arsenic, violating the regulations meant to prevent such tragedies, was summoned before the police court. He was charged with unlawfully selling poison without proper safeguards, once for providing undyed arsenic to Frances, and again for selling it to the girl Parker without a required witness present. For each infraction he received a fine of £1, a small but stinging reminder that his negligence had been one of the invisible hands shaping the fatal chain of events. Meanwhile, inside her prison cell, Frances's defiance slowly began to crumble. At first she clung to her protestations of innocence, repeating to anyone who visited that she had been wronged, that she had loved her husband, that she'd never intended him harm. But as the days passed and the reality of the gallows pressed upon her with suffocating certainty, her composure faltered. The weight of her fate, so close and so final, left her shaken and terrified. She waited anxiously as her counsel submitted an appeal for clemency, a plea built upon the jury's recommendation for mercy, which had been made not from doubt, but perhaps from discomfort at sentencing a young woman to die. Finally, on the 4th of August 1869, word reached her cell. The Home Office had reviewed her case. Her death sentence was not to be carried out. Instead, it was commuted to life imprisonment. The gallows would not claim her. Yet the reprieve, though sparing her life, condemned her to a different kind of slow, grinding punishment. One lived behind the harsh walls of the Victorian prison system. Frances's years in custody were turbulent from the beginning. Following the initial proceedings, she was transferred from Worcester to the notorious Millbank prison in London, a place known for its cold corridors, strict discipline, and bleak routines. Later she would be moved again, this time to Fulham, where the conditions were no less severe. Over the years she spent in confinement, she accumulated at least 15 disciplinary charges, infractions recorded carefully in the prison registers. Many of these offences were mundane but forbidden, attempting to smuggle contraband hidden inside parcels sent to her. She was caught with items like bread, cheese, soap, and small scraps of meat. Simple comforts, but in the rigid world of Victorian imprisonment, such unauthorised possessions were treated as insubordination. Each instance resulted in punishment, solitary confinement, reduced rations, or other strict measures designed to break the will of disobedient inmates. Yet some of her actions were far more dramatic. On one occasion, during a moment of frustration, she shattered a glass object in anger, leaving the staff alarmed. In a more serious episode, she brandished a shovel at a prison officer, swinging it in a sudden fit of rage during a dispute about her disciplinary record. Such a violent outburst was rare among female prisoners and left the staff deeply unsettled. It also suggested that beneath her composed exterior, Frances was battling emotions she rarely allowed others to see. Despite the harshness of prison life and her repeated infractions, Frances did not lose all connection to the outside world. Remarkably, one relationship remained steady throughout her incarceration. Her nephew, a loyal and compassionate young man, continued to write to her over the years. In February of 1875, 6 years into her life sentence, he penned a heartfelt letter to the prison superintendent. In it, he offered to take full responsibility for his aunt upon her eventual release. "I beg to assure you," he wrote, "that I am able and willing to receive my aunt upon her release, which I hope is very near." His plea did not free her immediately, but it stands as a rare reminder that even those marked by scandal and disgrace are sometimes not entirely abandoned. In Frances's case, her nephew's devotion showed that despite the cloud of crime and controversy surrounding her name, traces of familial loyalty survived. Nearly 17 years passed before the authorities considered her fit for release. On the 27th of February 1886, the government issued an official order of licence to a convict, essentially granting Frances permission to live freely outside prison walls for the remainder of her sentence, provided she adhered strictly to the conditions of her licence. On the 2nd of March 1886, she stepped back into the world as a free woman. She was no longer the milliner whose trial had captivated the public. She was now a quiet figure emerging from years of penal servitude, carrying with her a past she would never entirely escape. Following her release, Frances sought the anonymity offered by the growing sprawl of Birmingham. By the time of the 1901 census, she was living with her Uncle Richard, a sign that her family, despite the notoriety she once bore, had not turned her away. Even more surprisingly, at some point after her release she adopted a daughter. For a woman once condemned for destroying her own household, the adoption was a striking attempt to rebuild what she had lost. It suggested a longing to form bonds, seek redemption, and perhaps create a version of domestic life untouched by scandal. Her trade changed slightly as well. Rather than returning to millinery, she became a dressmaker, a profession likely influenced by the sewing and needlework she had been required to learn during her years in prison. Dressmaking offered both a respectable living and a quiet existence, and Frances seemed content to let her days unfold without drawing attention. A decade later, the 1911 census paints a picture of a woman who had successfully retreated into an ordinary life. At 69 years old, she was still living in Birmingham with her adopted daughter. The household appeared modest but stable. For someone who had once stood before a judge awaiting a sentence of death, this quiet domestic scene is almost astonishing. It shows a woman who, against all odds, managed to carve out normalcy from the rubble of her past. Yet Frances was not done reshaping her identity. By the time the 1921 census was taken, she had subtly revised her name. She appeared as Fanny Messenger Oliver, reintroducing her birth name, Messenger, after decades of using her married identity. Whether this change reflected a desire to reconnect with her origins, or simply an effort to distance herself from the events of 1869, remains unknown. Her occupation was still listed as a dressmaker, though a note made clear that age and infirmity had left her unable to work. She was now an old-age pensioner nearing the end of her long, complicated life. On the 11th of December 1926, Frances died at the age of 84. The cause was recorded as a cerebral hemorrhage complicated by bronchitis, an unremarkable end for a woman whose life had once gripped the public imagination. Yet even her death carried a final curious twist. Her certificate identified her as the widow of Alfred Oliver, architect, a description entirely untrue. Joseph Oliver, the only husband she had ever had been a boilermaker, not an architect, and he had died decades earlier under the cloud of the very crime that defined her life. Whether the false information came from a confused informant or was the final veil she cast over her past remains a mystery. And so the story of Frances Maria Oliver came to its quiet conclusion. A life forged in respectability, shattered by betrayal and suspicion, reshaped by imprisonment, and ultimately rebuilt in unexpected ways. Her tale, woven from love, deception, tragedy, and endurance, lingers because it reveals the many contradictions contained within a single human life. To the Victorian public, she was a villain. To her nephew, she was family worth protecting. To the prison system, she was troublesome but not beyond reform, and to history she remains a haunting figure whose actions and consequences continue to provoke fascination. Her journey from milliner to accused murderer, from condemned woman to elderly dressmaker, reflects both the severity of Victorian justice and the resilience of the human spirit. Even decades after the trial that once captivated Dudley, the shadows of her past never fully lifted, but neither did they fully define the woman she became in the years that followed.